For having us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and welcome everyone. We, as Rachel mentioned, we are avid podcast listeners, and I don't know, about 6 or 7 years ago, we decided that we should have a podcast practice at Loeb, and so Rachel and I built this one. And so we represent a wide variety of podcast folks in the podcast industry, from advertisers and advertising networks to podcast networks to individual podcasters, all the way down the line. So we have a lot of experience on all sides of the podcast world. And we're here tonight to give you some legal considerations for podcasters. And I think Rachel's going to kick us off with a little overview of this is our disclaimer, just saying these opinions do not reflect that of Loeb Loeb, just of us. It's the standard legal disclaimer. And then Rachel's going to give us a little overview of what we're going to cover tonight.
Yeah, so tonight we're going to cover some of the major topics that we see every day in our podcast practice, whether we're representing actual, individual podcasters, podcast companies, other media companies that are acquiring rights to podcasts, anyone in the industry. Ownership is probably on top of everybody's mind as they're creating podcasts, distributing podcasts, trying to get advertising for podcasts, getting licensing their podcasts. So we'll talk a little bit about the different kinds of ownership models, who owns back catalogs, those kinds of things. And then next to ownership, obviously, it's how do we make money, right? Everyone's in podcasting because they love it, but also to make some money. So we'll talk through different revenue sharing models we're seeing these days. And then a big topic that comes up all the time is what happens if you want to turn your podcast into a TV show or a film or do live tours? Who controls the right to do those derivative exploitations? How does the revenue get shared among all the participants? How do decisions get made? And then the last sort of big legal topic that we deal with on a day-to-day basis on all sides is clearance, making sure that you have the rights to use anyone who's appearing on your podcast, any music, particularly that's in your podcast, any clips, any artwork, that kind of thing. And we get questions about this all the time. We know we're still maybe a little bit less in the Wild West these days, but we're still pretty much in the Wild West of podcasting. There haven't been major lawsuits yet about clearance, but we fully expect to see some of those coming down the pike. And then we'll just chat, and we'd love to hear from you too about what's next for podcasting. We all know about the big ticket deals that get announced in the trades, the Joe Rogans, the armchair experts, those kinds of things, consolidation in the industry. So we'd love to hear from you also on what you're seeing in the market as well. All right, with that, we'll kick it off, and Anne will start sharing about ownership.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the biggest topics that comes up for all of our clients on all sides of podcasting, is who owns it. A lot of folks start independently. They, get an advertising deal. They are recording out of their closet, the prototypical podcaster. And then a lot of our podcasters start by joining a network, Lemonada, AudioChuck, various networks that are, acquiring podcasts or producing podcasts for talent. And those deals too come down to who's going to own it. Who is the network going to own it? Is the individual podcaster going to own it? Are they going to split ownership? We, as traditional intellectual property lawyers, Rachel and I always have an ingrained fear of joint ownership of anything. It sort of strikes fear into the heart of all IP lawyers. But it is a more common model in podcasting that obviously leads to, having two sort of masters of the ownership of any podcast. Then, if there's a sale, like Rachel was mentioning, in terms of major sales of podcasts, then both owners have to sign off on it. Both owners have to negotiate the deal for that sale, and then both owners have to be compensated for that sale. So there's pluses and minuses to shared ownership, but we do deal with that more often in the podcast space than in other spaces. And then another model that I think a lot of folks are familiar with are the exclusive licenses. That's, a Spotify exclusive, or, a Wondery exclusive, or that sort of that sort of model where they're going to exclusively license the podcast and the RSS feed, but the owner retains ownership. They can't put it out on, every platform is not available everywhere. It's only available on that one platform. Obviously, Luminary had that as well in terms of behind the paywall for podcasts. So that's another sort of structure of ownership. And then what we've been seeing, I would say more lately, is these advertising only deals where, a podcast builds up a certain reputation or, has been around for a while, has a significant back catalog, and they do a deal with a major ad network to provide that advertising and put it, obviously put in all of the back episodes and then obviously sell the advertising going forward. These have been, significant deals. I know Wondery's been doing this, Sirius has done it. It's a very popular model as well in the industry, and I think only getting more popular. The key issues in terms of ownership that come up for any podcast owner are obviously the RSS feed and the back catalog. You want to keep all of those rights together. You want to make sure that you own the RSS feed. That'll obviously be your list of subscribers and your biggest sort of asset in any sort of sale. And then the back catalog, obviously for what we mentioned before in terms of monetization, you want to make sure that you have that back catalog, that it comes with you, that you doesn't stay with whatever network you originally had your podcast with. That often comes up in the negotiations we do in terms of whether they get a continuing license to it, how long can they monetize the back catalog, when can you take it with you, do you owe them a piece of the future revenue on that because they helped pay to produce those episodes. Those kinds of issues come up in our negotiations all the time. And then another thing that comes up a lot is exclusivity and holdbacks. When you're working with a network and they're paying for you to produce the podcast, there's a certain amount of exclusivity that's expected. Certainly, they don't want you to come out with something that's competitive with the podcast. Otherwise, that undermines everyone's ability to monetize it. And then there'll also be holdbacks for similar podcasts, maybe for derivatives of that podcast, which we'll talk about later, maybe for books based on that podcast. Those kinds of things, which means that you won't be able to exploit those kinds of derivatives or other items during a certain period, or they want to make sure that the podcast is the focus, so they can really sell advertising against it and really monetize it in the initial period of time when it's first coming out. And then one of the last issues that comes up, which is related to ownership, is the approvals and consultation. Obviously, as the creator of the podcast, one wants to keep as much control as possible over what is finally put out there and what the final product looks like. But we do, as the network, when we're on that side of the deal, we understand that the network also has a vested interest in making sure that it's not putting out anything that goes against, the tenets of the network, or obviously anything that would be legally problematic. They want to make sure they have a right to remove that content or to keep it from going, out in the first place. And then the consultations also come up in terms of merchandising, sometimes in terms of marketing, in terms of what the network can do with the content after it's, part of the podcast. Rachel, is there anything else I missed or I didn't hit there that we should talk about?
I think that's great. I would just add, in the event that a network insists on owning the podcast, one way that the creator can maintain some control is via the approvals and consultations. So, okay, fine, network, you can own the podcast, but I, the creator, get to approve all the hosts and the guests, and I get to approve the title, and I get to approve the logo and artwork, and I get to approve any derivative exploitation. So, you may not own it, but you still have a voice in the room, and, get to, if you can negotiate extensive approvals. That's the model we've seen as well.
And it also often comes up in the context of host-read ads. In terms, there's layers of that. Do you get to approve the content? Do you get to approve who the advertisers are? Do you get to approve a certain percentage of the advertisers? Do you get to block certain categories of advertisements? So that those kinds of approvals are always a negotiation point in all of our deals. And with varying levels of success, depending on who we're negotiating for and who we're negotiating against. Right. I'll turn it over to Rachel for the all-important revenue sharing.
Yeah. So, we've seen a lot of different models for how to actually monetize podcasting. There's the big splashy deals we read about in the papers. There's just standard advertising splits. There's advances against advertising. There's, full buyouts. So it really can run the gamut. Again, like we said, we're sort of in the Wild West still. There's no sort of, we get calls all the time saying, well, what's standard? And Ann and I are like, no such thing. There's no standard. We can tell you what like Spotify likes to do, or what Apple likes to do, or what Amazon likes to do. But even that, not standard. So one thing that we have seen, I don't know if any of you also work in the TV and film business, but in the TV and film business, when there's revenue sharing, you'll often get a 15-page definition of what it means to share in modified adjusted gross revenues or net proceeds or whatever the definition is. And there's all sorts of deductions and exclusions. And, it's a very complicated definition, essentially guaranteeing that nothing will ever get paid out.
Yep.
So far, we haven't seen that trend. Normally, when there is some split of ad revenue sharing, it's a pretty clean definition. The network may take some distribution fee off the top, 5 or 10% from all of the revenues that they're collecting. They may take some small sales agency fees and then recover all of, if the network is paying the cost of production, they'll recover the cost of production. And then after that, it really is a split. It's a pretty clean definition. If someone wanted to go audit it, it wouldn't be that hard to audit because there's only a few deductions. So that is really a benefit of being in this industry, is that it's not a completely opaque way of trying to make money on splitting advertising revenue. We also always get the question, well, what's the standard split? Again, no such thing as standard. It's completely negotiated. It will depend on who the production company is, who the host is, what kind of podcast it is, what kind of network it is. We've seen sizable advances and guarantees against ad revenue splits. It can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for, even 10 episodes or 20 episodes or whatever it is. It really can be sizable advances, and then those will be advanced against some split of the ad revenue that the network ultimately or the distributor ultimately collects. And we've seen those advances increase both for celebrities and just in general. I think, everyone's chasing content and good content. So there really is room to negotiate, especially with the big consolidated players. So, that may be what you guys are typically seeing, are these sort of ad revenue models. There's also, as Ann said, just a straight ad revenue model where you can engage one of the big companies to go out, sell your ads. The company will take 20 to 30-ish% of anything they collect and give you the rest, and you own your podcast full out. And then there are some networks that are going to more of what we like to coin the Netflix model, which is they'll just pay you a bigger amount upfront. They'll pay your production costs, and then they'll pay you some sort of premium, 10, 20, 30% above your production costs, and buy out all of the rights. So they don't have to get audited. You wouldn't get any statements about ad revenue. They don't even have to sell ads. The network can just own the entire project. And that may be a great model if it's something that a podcaster is, has a great idea about, but doesn't want to make it their life, and they're ready to do 8 episodes, hand it over to a Spotify and walk away to their next project. That may be a model that really works. Again, all negotiable. And then the last thing that we have seen, especially with sort of more startup companies, are equity participations. So for big names, in order to get them to come to your startup podcasting network, as opposed to going to one of the big players, actually giving them stock in the company. That is obviously a gamble for whoever is going with that startup, right? You don't know if the company is going to ever be worth anything. But if it blows up or it gets bought, and we'll talk about consolidation later, there's a potential for upside. So I know we've seen a lot more podcasters requesting equity ownership, or companies offering it in lieu of paying bigger advances. And then there's all sorts of ancillary revenue streams we'll get into in the derivatives, but this is how do you make money with your podcast? You sell ads, you license the rights, you sell the rights outright, or you get equity in the company. Those are sort of the main avenues these days.
Yeah, another thing we've been seeing a lot of lately has been bonuses based on, I mean, it's true in TV as well, but we've been seeing it in podcasting as well. So if the podcast reaches a certain download threshold, there's a bonus that's also an advance against the revenue share, but it can be helpful for podcasts that are successful, especially if they're, those 6, 8, 10 episode podcasts. Having a bonus like that can be a good thing in terms of getting more compensation to the podcaster.
Yeah, and then we'll get into this also in a minute, but that also gets to how do you measure how many downloads?
Well, right. That's always a question. All right. So now we'll go into the all important derivative exploitations. I think we've all been seeing more of these lately. Dropout, We Crashed, Shrink Next Door. More older ones are Blackout, Homecoming, I think was one of the first ones. We've seen a lot of folks, especially with COVID probably, but even before COVID, it was a trend, but we're certainly seeing even more podcasts turned into film and TV, certainly books. Obviously, touring was always a big part of the podcast world, and hopefully with maybe COVID, I don't know, slowing down, we will see more of that coming back because we all want to go see our favorite podcasters on tour again. But so these are all considered derivatives of the podcast, and they're often pre-negotiated, or at least the who controls it is often pre-negotiated. When you do a deal with a network, often the network will want to control these rights. As the podcaster, we're often fighting for that podcaster to have some sort of participation, if not some form of control over those derivatives, or carving out derivatives that they already have, which is also something that we've seen and that we've worked on with several podcasts. In terms of who controls the derivatives, often it's who has the best access to control them. If you're doing something with, if you're doing something with Netflix, obviously they have a good mechanism for creating those derivatives and exploiting those derivatives. If you're doing something with a smaller network, usually the network wants some say in it, they want some participation in it, but is it going to be their agent who takes it out? Is it going to be yours? How that all works out is often part of a negotiation. And we do like to negotiate that up front because we do want to make sure that at least we have an obligation to negotiate it. At least we have an obligation to discuss in good faith. At least, if we need to carve something out, but you already have a book that you started before you did the podcast, or that you already have a deal for a book, we want to carve that out of any sort of control by whomever you're working with for the podcast. Then when we have the podcast network not controlling those rights, they do often ask for a passive participation or a right of first negotiation. So, if it really, you gave this podcast to the network, or they fully funded the podcast, we understand why they might want to get what we call a non-writing EP participation in a derivative, or some sort of royalty related to that derivative, but for their, initial investment in the podcast, there wouldn't be that derivative. So that's often part of our negotiations, and what that looks like and how that plays out is also part of the discussion. And then, but also vice versa, if the podcast network is controlling that derivative, then we want to make sure the creator has rights. They may get that non-writing EP role. They may want, some sort of, right to be on camera or to participate in the writing, those sorts of things. Depends on the stature of the podcast creator and how they fit into it. But we do want to make sure they're tied to those derivatives in some way, and they aren't just cut out from the process going forward. Then the control of the merchandising being another sort of derivative exploitation of the podcast. That's always important. And that always depends on who is, again, best situated to exploit those merchandising rights. It's often the podcast network because they have a merchandising deal, or they can make a merchandising deal for all of their podcasts. But again, making sure that's part of the revenue participation, or making sure the podcaster is somehow participating in that merchandising is a very important part of negotiating any deal with a network. So I think that's derivatives. I haven't watched Dropout yet, but I want to, so I'm looking forward to that. Rach is going to cover clearance issues.
Yeah. So we get these questions all the time. Well, it's a podcast. Can't we use 5 seconds of music, 30 seconds of music? Isn't there a rule that you can use less than a certain amount of music? No, there is no rule. Any use of music needs to be licensed. And, I think when podcasting first started and it wasn't, a real revenue generator, and it was more, the NPRs of the world, and then people just doing, like the Mark Marons in his garage doing podcasting, and it was not as sort of top of mind for so many people. Clearance wasn't a top concern. Nobody was worried about getting rights from the people appearing on their podcasts, or from using clips from films, or, audio clips from films, or music, or, just doing general clearance to make sure you're not defaming people in your podcast, that kind of thing. It really wasn't as big of a deal as I think it is now that, podcast listening is so much bigger. There are so many giant companies, Spotify has gone all in. It bought, I don't know how many companies in the last 5 years.
Yes.
Major companies, Amazon bought Wondery, these are major conglomerates and major media companies that are in the space and don't want to be sued on a regular basis. So, our advice to our clients who are creating podcasts or producing podcasts is clear everything. So when you're interviewing people for your podcast, or if you have a scripted podcast and you have actors on your podcast, make sure you're getting written releases. That's best practice. A release that says you, the podcast company, can use their interview name and likeness in connection with the podcast for in perpetuity throughout the world in any and all media, not just audio media, because who knows if your podcast is going to get turned into something else. Or you want to advertise it in, on the internet or something like that.
This is a question we get all the time. We do like written releases. I mean, I know we're lawyers, so we like everything written, but I get the question all the time. It's a podcast. Can't I just do an audio release? Can't I just say, hey, you're on my podcast. You agree to be on my podcast. And we record that and we call it a day. And we're always say, if that's the only thing you can do, then yes, obviously that's better than nothing. But to Rachel's point, if that's all you say and you don't say anything else and you don't have all of our fun words in there, you have to go back to them for those other exploitations. If you want to use it in merchandising, if you want to use it in a derivative, in a TV show or a film, you have to go back and get that permission. Whereas if you get the release that's written beautifully in the first place, you don't have to worry about that. So we're trying to save you time on the back end by giving you more words on the front end.
Yeah, you either have to go get that release or take the risk that, this was an innocuous interview and it's my friend and they're never going to sue me. And
yeah, we get that we hear that all the time too.
Yes. So get written releases for people that appear on your podcasts, for any producers that are working, any editors, any sound mixers, anyone that's working on your podcast, you want to get a written agreement with, to make sure that you or your podcast company owns all of their, what we coin as results and proceeds, all of their work, and that there's no question that you own the full podcast. That is best practices. We understand doesn't happen all the time, but best practices. On music, there's plenty of services out there that will give you the ability to use music that is what is called royalty-free music, meaning you pay some fee. It can be a nominal fee. You could pay a subscription fee, like Blue Dot Sessions, I know is one of the big ones. And you can use their music in your podcast as long as you pay them their fees. Don't go putting Beyonce songs in your podcast.
They will sue you.
Any other uses of music, there is not an established way of licensing it. So if you want to put, an established song into your podcast, you'd have to reach out to the record label and the music publisher or the artist directly in order to get a license to use that music in your podcast. And, again, everyone knows a lot of podcasts don't make money, so they may charge you nothing or they may charge you a nominal fee. But again, better to have it in writing than to have someone come to you after the fact and send you a cease and desist or worse, sue you.
And Clinton actually pointed out a good thing in terms of writing your own music for the show. That also is a common way. Either you write your own music. I'm not musically inclined, so you would get some sort of friend who is more musically inclined than you are to write it, and again, execute an agreement with them that says that you own the song and you can use it in the podcast and everything else related to the podcast.
Yeah,
but that's common.
Yeah, a few years ago, SoundCloud went and took down a ton of podcasts because the record labels went and did an AI sweep of all of their music. And so any podcast that had music in it that was owned by one of the major record labels got taken down, and people lost their back catalogs if they didn't have backups. So it is very important. You may think, oh, my little podcast, nobody's gonna know that I use this song. But there is technology out there sweeping for this stuff, and it is always possible to get caught up in it. And then people always ask us, well, what about fair use? What if I'm using music and then talking about it? Well, that there are some considerations there, but generally our advice is no, let's clear all music that you're going to use in your podcast. Fair use is a defense, which means that someone would have to sue you for use of their materials or their property without you having licensed it. And then you go to court and defend it and say, well, I met the factors of fair use. I used it in a transformative way or an educational way, or you have a defense on why your use was permitted, even though you didn't get a license. So it's very costly. So we always advise, if possible, get a license. Obviously, if you're doing a show that's critical of R. Kelly and you want to include some music of to demonstrate your point or something like that, that's very connected to exactly what you're talking about, maybe there's a good case for fair use there because you probably can't get a license. But that's something definitely to talk about with your lawyer. And then someone asked here, how does trademarking work for a podcast? Is it helpful and necessary? And
this is good. We get this question all the time, even from established podcasters.
Yeah. So, to the extent that you are looking at creating a real brand about your podcast, you want to merchandise, hopefully you want to do derivative projects, whether that's film, TV, live tours, anything like that. It is always helpful to trademark your podcast name to protect it. And you can do a US trademark. You can file with the Patent and Trademark Office. You can file in certain categories. To the extent that you're really operating in other countries, it may be helpful to do it in the other countries as well. But normally our clients tend to trademark just in the US, maybe in the UK if they really have operations there. But if you really anticipate it being a big moneymaker, then I would say it is something to explore with your sorry, there's things happening on my screen, with your legal counsel. And anything else to add on that?
Well, we also get the question about copyright and whether you need to file copyright registration in the Copyright Office for each episode of your podcast or your entire catalog of podcasts. So just, a refresher on copyright, they are automatically copyrighted as soon as you create them. So you do have that sort of common law copyright in everything that you create. Whether you want to have the benefit of doing the registration is that you get what is called statutory damages. So if there's an infringement on your podcast, on the copyright of your podcast, then you are entitled to what are the damages that are set forth in the copyright statute. So there is a benefit to it. Also, the place that it practically comes up when you're not being sued for infringement is that if it's going to be optioned for a television show or a film, something of that nature, there's generally speaking going to be an assignment of that copyright, and they're going to want to see that that's filed in the Copyright Office. No, you can copyright it at any time. It's not like you created it today, it needs to be copyrighted by tomorrow, or you lose the right to register it. You can you could file the registration at any time. So you don't have to file the registration until you get to that point, or you think you're going to get to that point. The registration is relatively cost effective. It's not an expensive registration, and you can file it online, and you don't really need a lawyer to file it. It's a pretty straightforward application. So there's no harm in doing it. But it's certainly not required. And a lot of even our major podcast networks don't copyright their podcasts, don't file for registrations for their copyright, their podcast episodes. Sometimes they file, an entire season at one time, or if they won't file it until they have several seasons of a podcast, or they may never file it and then just rely on their common law rights of copyright. So it's a little bit of a nuanced question, but it's certainly not a requirement. And if you shouldn't feel behind if you haven't yet filed for copyright for your podcast.
Kira asked if we have a template for written releases for guests. Amanda, I don't know if this is something that the Podcast Academy provides. I don't know if you want to weigh in here. If not, we can certainly talk about it.
If you build it, they will come. We'll have a survey at the end of this as well, if there is a interest in the TPA membership and potentially an invitation for somebody like yourselves to come back. We don't currently have an existing template, but never say never.
Excellent. Well, good. I like it. I like the teasing of new adventures for the TPA. So the next one we're gonna hit, and obviously keep the questions coming if anyone has any. What's next for podcasting? I think everyone's talking about this. You get the regular sort of legal trends or trends for podcasting. I think that the big ones are obviously, as we mentioned before, we alluded to before, was the more accessible data for podcasting. What are we gonna, well, I mean, there's always been a question. I think it was very sort of not to overuse the analogy, but definitely the Wild West before, in terms of how we were measuring downloads, how we were measuring streaming, how we were going to look at that. And I think once the IAB got involved and major advertisers were involved, there was a little bit more. Oh, I think we lost. Did we lose? Uh-oh.
I think Rachel might have accidentally
we lost
out.
Rachel.
Oh, well, I believe that your slide, I can certainly share it if that would be helpful. There was just a couple more points on there. Let me just go ahead and do that. And then hopefully Rachel will find her way back in.
Yeah, hopefully she can come back.
Fun times with Wi-Fi, everybody. Thanks for your patience. There we go. So you can at least see it yeah.
All right. Well, I'll keep going. So, okay, what were we talking about? Oh, yes, better data and reporting. So this is always a question, especially when we're talking about bonuses, we're talking about revenue shares. What are we basing that on? How are we looking at the money that's coming in? How are we evaluating how many streams or downloads? How are we measuring the success of the podcast? It's also a question that we get from podcasters to the networks in terms of, what data are you going to share with me? Am I going to be able to see, like in TV, a +1, +3, +7 in terms of who's listening to the podcast and when are they listening to it, because that's going to impact the advertising money as well. So all of those things vary, obviously, dramatically, depending on who you talk to. But there is the IAB standard in terms of downloads and streams. So there's growing sort of coalescence in terms of how these things are measured, but I think that will certainly be something that improves going forward. Oh, good. We got Rachel back, I think. It's exciting. We lost her. It was very sad. The next one, which we talked about a little bit, has been acquisitions and conglomerates, which I think everyone has seen. Everyone's acquiring everybody, and podcasts are moving from place to place depending on their revenue. So I certainly don't think that's going to slow down anytime soon. I mean, we still hear about them all the time. We still I think we've certainly seen it slow down a little bit in the last, I'd say 6 months, but I'm certain that it's here to stay. And as long as there's, advertising revenue to be gotten or benefits to be had by the major players from acquiring folks that are bringing new technology into the podcasting industry, I'm sure it will continue. And then the derivative exploitation we talked about, and I love seeing more of that. We're seeing a lot of optioning. We're seeing a lot of things go to film and television. We're certainly, I think is always true, seeing more optioning than things that actually make it to the screen. But, I think that's just part of the industry. But as long as we're seeing interest from, major Hollywood players in that space, we're happy because, the more people that are interested, the better. Then international expansion, we've certainly seen. Obviously, key markets are, I would say Southeast Asia, the Asian markets, and then certainly Latin America has been a huge market and had a huge explosion in podcasts over the last, I'd say, 2 years. UK has already had a very established podcast sort of market, so that's not new, but is still a very strong market for podcasters. And then, as Rachel was just talking about, we certainly don't think that podcasters will be immune from lawsuits over clearance issues, over distribution rights, and certainly not over ownership. It probably hasn't come out as much as in other industries, but it's certainly inevitable. And then a couple other things that I thought of that didn't make the slide, but since COVID, we've seen obviously a lot of celebrities, enter podcasts. They weren't able to work on traditional sets, so they were doing podcasts. SmartList probably being the biggest example of that and the most splashy one. But there's also been a lot of innovation in podcasting. There was what was it called? It was the full length movie podcast that what was her name? She was in it. Oh, anyway, they were advertising it. It sounded, I didn't listen to it, obviously, or else I would remember it. But I just enjoyed that they had like the movie phone guy doing the announcement. And it was very like, sit down with like a bucket of popcorn and listen to this podcast. I enjoy the innovation. I'm here for finding new ways to do podcasts, to market podcasts. I love it. I think we'll see even more innovation. And I think playing on that, I think we'll see more scripted. Writers were also bored during COVID. So there's a lot more, WGA writers and also other script writers that are participating in making podcasts. And there's more folks, looking to expand into this area. So I think we'll certainly see more of that coming out and in the future. Rach, is there anything else? We lost you. Is there anything else?
I know. Sorry, my internet connection said, "Oh no, slides too much." The other things that I feel like we see so much of now are companion podcasts. So, there's TV shows. Netflix has a whole bunch of them. HBO has a whole bunch of them. So they'll have companion podcasts with maybe the showrunner or producer, and they'll do behind the scenes interviews and talk about the show. And, it's just another way to engage. Those are not money makers. Those are ways to engage audiences.
My favorites are the rewatches though, Rach, like Gilmore Guys, the New Girl one. I love it. I love hearing all the dirt.
Office Ladies.
Yeah.
There's so many rewatch podcasts. I mean, nostalgia has been a big thing in TV too. There's so many reboots. I never thought we'd see Full House be rebooted, but here we are. The nostalgia podcasts are rampant. I feel like any sort of teen star in the 90s can do a rewatch podcast.
So true. I'm probably, they're clearly catering to us, but I'll take it. It's fine. The question that just came up is a good one about an LLC and the host personal finances that we always recommend you have a separate LLC because that does limit your liability. I mean, is it a foolproof method? No, but it certainly provides more protection than doing it personally.
Especially if you're operating it as a business and you're actually putting expenses in the LLC and hopefully collecting revenue in the LLC, entering into contracts in the LLC's name, really using it as a business. Typically the LLC will hold all the liability and it won't go up to you as the owner of the LLC.
Yeah. And it'll keep the tax. It also keeps it clear from it. Not that we are tax lawyers, so don't confuse us with those, but it does keep it does keep the tax things separated from yours. And Kira is a big fan of her LLC, so she can talk from personal experience on that. But yeah, let us know if you have any questions, and then obviously feel free to reach out if you think of anything. We are happy to talk. Obviously, if you have any recommendations, we're here for those too.
Yeah, this is so great and insightful. Thank you so much. And we have some really great questions, but I might invite our participants. Please don't be shy. Feel free to ask any questions. I do have a quick one, and I think this might appeal to people who are a little bit earlier in their podcasting careers. That might be, if you're starting out, are there any like small housekeeping things that are kind of manageable at any scale that people should do when they're having legal considerations as podcasters?
Well, I think the LLC one is a great one. I mean, it's relatively inexpensive to open an LLC. You can do it on your Secretary of State's website. I mean, it's not a complicated process. So I think that's a great one to just keep everything separate. And then I would say, having like a one paragraph, it doesn't have to be long, it doesn't have to be complicated, but like a one paragraph release that you give to your guests, just so you have that protection, is probably another good, easy housekeeping thing.
Yeah, those are great. And then I would just add, if you have co-hosts or co-founders or anything like that, everyone goes in thinking we're best friends, we're never going to have a problem. But to the extent you can get it in writing that, okay, we own the podcast 50-50, or I own 100% of the podcast and you're just the co-host, so there's no question going forward. Because, if your thing blows up and becomes the next big podcast and one person thinks they were 50-50 partners and the other person thinks I own 100% of it, you're going to have a problem. So there are difficult conversations to have, easier when you're splitting everything 50-50, but I would say if you have co-hosts or co-founders that you're having those conversations early, and, at the very least you have a piece of paper that says, these are the things we've agreed to and we sign it, even if it's not a full legal agreement, let's get at least a deal memo or something like that. And
I was just having this conversation with two people who are starting a production company for a podcast, and I said, well, who's the tie break call depending on what the decision is, and they're like, no, it's just 50-50, and I'm like, right,
I can agree.
Yeah, that works until you don't agree, and then you can't move forward, and then your business is stuck. So why don't we figure out who's going to tie break? Are you going to have creative tie break? You have business tie break. Are you going to have tie break on these issues? Tie break on those, because that's we're dealing with many. The lawyers always get called when things go wrong, so we deal with the dissolution of these wonderful partnerships that were started at love that have now devolved into not love. So let's figure out how to figure that out in going forward instead of at the end.
And then the other thing I would just add is, when you're starting out your podcast, maybe there's not a lot of revenue potential, but once you have a back catalog and, you can monetize it, I don't know, on YouTube or on Apple or wherever you're monetizing it, if you're having conversations with major distributors, just make sure to read the ownership provisions very carefully, because you don't want to get stuck in a situation where you have 100 episodes and all of a sudden you don't own anything anymore. That's just really focus on who owns what and who even if it says you own it, if the distributor gets exclusive perpetual worldwide distribution, you own it, but you can't do anything with it.
Exactly.
So, just focusing on who owns what rights, who controls what rights, that is paramount in controlling what your work is, how your work is exploited.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been cataloging these in the chat just so people could crystallize these really amazing tips. I hope that I've captioned correctly, but please feel free as lawyers to correct my interpretation. I don't see any other questions, so I hope it's we have another good one. Thank you, Kira. Are there any legal considerations podcasters should have with sponsors? So, for example, in the context of sending an invoice, it states what's included in their package and the ad script's approval.
Yeah, that's perfect. If you have a sponsor that's going to pay you and you agree to read an ad in the middle or at the beginning of each podcast, and they get to approve the script, you lay all that out, lay out exactly what they're going to pay you, when they're going to pay you, how long, how many episodes their ads are gonna be in. Yeah, that all sounds great.
Yeah. And you can do it in, I think, Carrie, you can do it in invoice. That's totally fine. I
Yeah.
mean, we lawyers, we like lots of paper, lots of words, but you can get the points across in an invoice, and you can certainly cover that. I think it's just making sure that they're approving what you're writing, so you know that you're not reading something you're not comfortable with. Because a lot of our advertisers will say, you know, a personal experience with the product or something like that. And, you know, podcasters want to be creative with how they present that. They don't want to just say, you know, I had Blue Apron, it was great. Like they want to go into something fun. So as long as you can write it and they have the approval, you'll be in a better.
And just make sure, I mean, you guys are all pros, but make sure that when you read the ad that you say, this is a sponsor, this is an ad.
Right.
So that everyone
different
knows
ad music, something that makes it clear.
I always remember when Gimlet was first starting and they did Startup the first season, they had this like really cutesy, I don't know if they still use it, this really like cutesy music they put under the ads. And they went to, I think, a mom and a kid, and they were talking about including the kid in the show, and he was so excited. And then it turned out that the kid was in an ad, not as part of the show. And the mom got really upset, and they talked about it on the show. And they're like, well, we screwed up. We forgot to, like, we weren't specific enough that the kid was going to be in the ad for the show, not in the show itself. But anyway, that's an aside. So yes, just be very clear about the fact, you know, there are FCC rules that you have to say that you're being sponsored and that's an ad. So just be clear about that.
Yeah, and you can, those actually really detailed, and actually, I think creator friendly guidelines on the FTC in terms of the sponsor, because they've spent a lot of letters out, and they've been a lot of advertisers, especially in the social media age, that have had trouble with that. So I would definitely check those out, because they do, as Rachel is saying, they make it clear that you have to say that it's sponsored, and you have to say that it's an ad, and you can make it clear, you know, you can make it clear with music. You can, I mean, a lot of, you know, Sawbones is a good one where they're like, we'll go to the billing department. You can make it cute, just make sure it's clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Kira had a follow-up just saying, is it enough to put in show notes that it's an ad, or does it need to be declared verbally?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, we are sponsored by, or like Anne said, having the separate music that delineates it, that's clear that it's an ad.
I mean, podcast listeners are savvy enough that they get it. I think if it's just this, it doesn't have to be a dramatic, like we're doing ads. It can be like a little bit of, you know, a cute lead in. I know Stuff You Miss in History class has like a little ba-bong thing that goes into the ads. So like, it doesn't have to be dramatic, but it just needs to be clear that that's not part of the show.
Right.
Very illuminating and helpful. Also, Kira, I believe you could be a co-host for the any
I know,
talk on how to
join
do
us for the next one.
Next time, Kira, you're up here with us.
Yeah.
This is great. Yeah, these are really great questions that you've been able to answer. Such important, like this is probably 500,000 foot view. I would love to hear all these stories that you have to navigate in these sticky situations. I don't think I see too many other questions. I'll close with this one. What is a myth that you wish every podcast person that you've ever worked with would just remember, so that you don't have to bill them for those hours?
Oh, Rachel already mentioned it.
Yeah.
It's that there's like 10 seconds free. I mean, it's not just podcasters, all of our TV people do it too. But my favorite one was, they were filming and they were like, but I was across the street, so it's okay. And I was like, what does that mean? Like you weren't trespassing, but you're still showing like the name and the trademark and the logo of everything. Like, I don't care where you were, you're still infringing. And then I can use 10-second clip of this TV show, or I could use a 10-second clip of this music, or I can use 10 seconds. I get all the time. If it's less than 10 seconds, it's fine. And I'm like, where did this come from? Like, who perpetuated this rule? Because it is not a rule. It is not a thing. Like, fair use analysis, as Rachel said, is a very complicated analysis, and it's a defense. Like, you don't just because you did 10 seconds, it's, don't worry and you're scot-free. So I wish every creator would forget that, because I have to have that conversation more often than I would.
So it's probably the same place where the 2-second rule of food on the floor came from,
Yes,
which is the rule of every biologist. And,
I try to teach my kids that doesn't apply to like the peanut butter that you put on the floor. It's gross.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, we have one final question. We'll wrap up this amazing webinar with. You're getting a lot of appreciation in the chat, echoing mine, echoing Michelle's. From Joy, how long is the trademark process? Great closeout question, Joy. Thank you.
It depends. It can be, there's two kinds of trademarks. There's a use trademark and then an intent to use trademark. A use trademark is one you're already using, obviously. If you file that, I mean, the Patent and Trademark Office, like everybody, I guess, and since COVID is very delayed. So it can take up to a year to get a full trademark. I mean, but you're backdated to when you filed the application. So whenever you file it, once it's approved and once you get a registration number, it goes back to when you actually filed it. So that's a plus. The intent to use is I'm going to be releasing this, merchandise, this product, this podcast, and within hopefully the next 6 months, though you have 6-month extensions for up to 3 years. So then you file the application, and then ultimately your application gets approved, and then you have to prove that use. So you have to file your actual use with the trademark office, and then you get backdated to that date of filing. So it can be a very long process, but it goes back to the date that you actually filed. So you do get that protection, even if the Patent and Trademark Office takes a really long time to look at everything.
All right. So I think we got our marching orders, y'all. We're going to set up LLCs. We don't have them. We're going to trademark our stuff. So at least if the paperwork's in, we can have that down. We're going to write everything down. We're going to have that really awkward discussion. Okay. So we're both 50-50 here.
Yeah.
Going to do the Paul, the John, the Ringo, and the George here.
Yeah.
That came from the music.
Don't turn into them. But but on the copyright point, remember, you can use the C in the circle all the time. You don't have to be read. You don't have to file for that. You can use that from the moment you create it. And we recommend that you do. Put it in your show notes. Put it on your website. Copyright whoever you are.
Oh, that's a really good tip too. Put copyright on everything. Cool beans.
Make it clear.
Well, we have just a couple more minutes left, and this has been such an informative session. And Rachel, I definitely hope this isn't the last time Loeb and Loeb LLP are kind enough to share this amazing insight on legal stuff. So folks, it's been a real pleasure to have you all in this room. I want to thank all of our TPA members who joined us and just for being members of the community. I dropped in the link and exit survey. We would really love to see that because we want to know what else should we be bringing back. I definitely know that I heard y'all. We want to have those really interesting talks on maybe contract template language, or at least a checklist on are you covered, which I think would be very helpful.
True. We can do that for sure.
Ooh, okay. All right. I've got that on record here. And I was just saying, do we have to do this writing or is it on video? Fine. I will save that question for later. But anyway, though, well, everybody, it's been a real pleasure. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.